Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Ijun. I'm currently a postdoc at Michigan State University, and today I'm excited to present some work I've been doing with my colleagues Jesse Wood, Scott Imberman, Nathan Jones, and Katherine Strunk. We, as a group, sorry, can you hear me? So we as a group are very interested in learning about teacher quality gaps, particularly for students with disability in general education classrooms. So a little bit of motivation. We begin with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1975, which promises free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And since that time, more and more students with disabilities have been able to mainstream into general education classrooms. So for example, today about 63% of students with disabilities are in general education classrooms for 80% or more of the day. And actually this percentage is higher for high incidence subgroups such as students with specific learning disabilities and students with speech or hearing impairment. So for those students, about 87% of students are in general education classrooms for 80% or more of the day. But in 2017, the US Supreme Court goes even further. In Andrew v. Douglas, they require more equitable outcomes for students with disabilities. Basically, they say, okay, we know that more students with disabilities are being mainstreamed into general education classrooms, but are they getting a rigorous enough education? What does it look like? And from the literature, what we see is that students with disabilities are still often behind in math and reading achievement. So moving on a little bit to the teacher literature, we find that teachers are probably the most important single factor in impacting students' achievement. But we also know that there's quite a bit of teacher sorting that'll lead to teacher quality gaps. And this happens both across schools and within schools. So taken together, we're not really quite sure what our A priori is in terms of teacher quality gaps for students with disabilities. They have some more legal protections, and districts are trying to be more careful in terms of how they're placing students with disabilities, but we still don't know. For example, like within classrooms, people may see students with disabilities as a more difficult student, and so there may still be some sorting within schools. So our team wants to look at 4 different questions, but I'm going to concentrate on the last 3. But one, we want to know whether or not teacher quality varies across schools based on school level disadvantage. And then we want to look overall. In general, are there teacher quality gaps between students with disabilities and those who do not have disabilities? And then do these teacher quality gaps vary by school level disadvantage? And then finally, whether or not this varies by disability subgroup. So what we find is yes, I'm just going to give you a little preview. Yes, our most consistent gaps are for teacher evaluation scores. For students with disabilities in general, teacher quality gaps, we find some for math, particularly for VAMs and teacher evaluation. For ELA teachers, we find also for teacher evaluation, but we also see an increased exposure to novice teachers. And then, surprising for us, actually, we did not find a lot of teacher quality gaps varied by school level disadvantage. And then by disability subgroup, we say, yes, most of it is being driven by our highest incidence subgroup, which is specific learning disability. So moving on a little bit to our data and sample, we're using data from Los Angeles Unified School District. We're using 4 years of data, and okay. We are focused on public mainstream schools, particularly students in kindergarten through 8th grade, which leaves us with 1.1 million student year observations, about 13,000 unique teachers, and 619 schools. We created 3 different level bins for school disadvantage, but although we have played around with different sensitivity to see if we had different bins, but we're mostly focused on these 3, which is less than 70%, 70 to less than 95%, and 95 to 100% FRL. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. So I want to spend a little time talking about our teacher quality measures. So this will give us a slightly different subgroup for each one, so I wanted to spend a little time here. So our first measure is value-added measures, and we control for a lot of different student demographics, including prior test scores. So for that reason, in LAUSD, that means this is necessarily limited to students who are in between grades 4 through 8. In LA, we also have teacher evaluation scores. So this is mostly based on classroom observations and a series of different subcomponents, but only about 25 to 30% of the school gets a teacher evaluation score every year. So we don't have this available for everyone. And this is a new program that's been implemented in the past 4 years. So we only have this if you've been evaluated in the past 3 years, because we're taking your previous teacher evaluation score. Our third score is a hiring score, so also implemented new to school year 2014-15. LAUSD created this hiring screening system, which looks at things such as interview skills, your background, a sample lesson demonstration, and so they tally it all up to out of 100 points. So we're also going to take this to look at whether or not this is related to teacher quality. And what we find for this is that we can only have these scores for teachers who've been hired or rehired since school year 2015. Finally, our largest sample is novice teachers, so everybody has teacher experience within our administrative data. We're defining novice teacher as less than 2 years of experience, but we've also played around with different cut points like up to 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so sorry, I'm joining the club. No Greek, I didn't know that, I'm very sorry. But in general, I'm really sorry about that. But basically, we're looking at the average exposure rate for students with disability versus those without disabilities. And then for the teacher quality gap, we want to know whether or not this difference varies between our 3 different FRL bins. Okay, so overall teacher quality gap, I'm just going to look at the first row first. So we're looking at VAM, math VAMs, and we see that teachers or students with disabilities tend to be exposed to teachers with lower VAM scores, about 0.024 here. And we also do a variance decomposition to try to see what is driving these gaps. And for math VAMs, we find that most of this is being driven by within school variation. Similar story for teacher evaluation, we see that students with disability on average are exposed to math teachers with lower evaluation scores, and most of this is being driven by within school variation. And then for hiring a novice, we don't find a lot of significant differences, but our point estimates suggest maybe they could be possibly exposed to lower quality teachers in terms of these 2 measures. So we do the same thing for ELA as well, and we find that there is no significant gaps for VAM, though the point estimates again are negative. We also find significant gaps for teacher evaluation score and novice teacher. Getting to our third research question, but what does this look like within each different FRL bin? So for this, I'm going to start with the lowest poverty bin, and we find that there's a large gap within the lowest poverty bin, which I think was most surprising to me at least. So for this lowest poverty bin, students with disabilities are exposed on average to lower VAM, about 0.047 standard deviations lower VAM than their non-disabled peers. We don't see a lot of difference in terms of teacher evaluation or hiring score or experience for math teachers. For ELA, we find not a lot of difference in terms of VAM, but we do find significant differences in terms of teacher evaluation. Nothing much happening in terms of hiring score or teacher experience. Okay, so we're going to move on to the middle FRL bin, which is between 70 and less than 95% FRL. For math, there's not a lot of significance, but our point estimates again suggest perhaps there is some little tiny bit of sorting towards lower quality teacher for students with disabilities. For ELA, we find significant differences in terms of teacher evaluation scores and novice teacher. So this last bar graph will tell you whether or not these gaps are different than the one that I previously showed you in the lowest FRL bin. And we don't see a lot of, actually we don't see anything significantly different here. And then for our highest FRL bin, we find again significant differences in terms of math VAM, though nothing for teacher evaluation, hiring score, and experience. But for ELA, again, we find significantly more exposure to novice ELA teachers. And then the one thing I would like to point out here is for teacher evaluation score for ELA, it is actually significantly different from the top, from like the lowest FRL bin, which is saying that the gap between SWD and non-SWD is larger in the lowest FRL bin than the gap that exists for the highest FRL bin, which is not what I expected at all. Okay, so we're moving on to the specific learning disability. So this is our highest incidence subcategory, and perhaps not surprisingly then, since it makes up the majority of our students with disability, a lot of this mimics what we find in the general main analysis, which is there's lower VAM scores for math, particularly for the lowest FRL bin and the highest FRL bin. And then interestingly, we also find some significance in terms of lower teacher evaluation scores. But here, okay, here we find that these are actually significant. So kind of like what I mentioned before, our highest gap between students with disabilities and students without disabilities are in the lowest FRL bin, and these are significantly different than the almost significant for the middle FRL bin and then significantly different for the highest FRL bin. So really disadvantage gap I think is a bit of a misnomer in our case. In terms of students with autism, we were very curious to see what this looked like, and there's actually not a lot going on for students with autism in terms of LAUSD at least. And then for our last subcategory is students with speech and learning language impairment. And so point estimates kind of suggest that if any, there's like probably not a lot going on, but where there is, it seems like they may be actually getting higher quality teachers than their peers without disabilities, which I think was quite surprising for us. Okay, so some overall summary. So we do see some overall teacher quality gaps when comparing students with disabilities to their peers without disabilities. Particularly for math, we find it in VAM and then teacher evaluation scores. For ELA, we find it in terms of teacher evaluation scores and experience. But we also find quite a bit of variation within FRL bins. So specifically for math, we find that there's significant VAM teacher quality gaps. And then some for ELA, we find it for teacher evaluation and experience, but we don't find a lot of evidence that there are significant disadvantage gaps when we're comparing the gaps across the FRL bins. So in terms of subgroup analysis, most of it is driven by the specific learning disability students, and there's little evidence of significant gaps for students with autism, and maybe some suggestions that they have better quality teachers for students with speech and learning, or speech and hearing, right? Impairment, sorry. Policy implications. So how can we more equitably assign students to teachers? Well, I think the good thing from what we were looking at the variance decomposition was a lot of this variation is coming from within school sorting, which suggests that principals can do a little bit more shifting of students within the school, and that this could help to ameliorate this problem. If we're going to step outside of what our current structure is for LAUSD particularly, we would really like to recommend salary enhancements for teachers who are teaching potentially more challenging classes. And then that leads us to a couple of different potential avenues for future work. So we would love to understand a better understanding how students with disability are sorted into classrooms. Like according to different conversations I've had with staff at LAUSD, this is supposed to be a very random process, but it seems like it might not be. And so we would love some qualitative work to like kind of dig into that a little bit more as to what are the politics at within each school. And then for us specifically using administrative data, I think where we would love to go next is we're curious about these general education teachers, and we want to know whether or not some of them have a comparative advantage in teaching students with disability compared to their peers, and whether or not this plays out in both test score and non-test score outcomes. So I will leave it at that and leave it over to Ray.